Welcome to the next lecture in the Hyde Lecture series for 15-16, continuing our effort to ask practitioners what's next in our disciplines. And today I'm really happy to have Frank Barkow here as the next speaker, following up from Sarah Whiting from Rice last week. Frank and his partner Regina Leibinger founded their practice in 1993 after first meeting at the GSD at Harvard in the late 1980s, where they received their Masters of Architecture. The interdisciplinary discursive attitude of the practice allows their work to expand and respond to advancing knowledge and technology, and I would add to also a merging of theory and practice into a singular endeavor that in our school we talk about as design research, an effort to interrogate projects and to look for new ways of proceeding as architects that actually expands beyond the immediate needs of a client, but in many cases informs the way work for clients actually proceeds. Current research projects in the office have focused on infralight concrete, facade systems, space frames, ceramic elements, and these explorations find their ways into various projects and project types ranging from industrial buildings to housing and cultural projects. And as art critic Hal Forster writes, they see industrial architecture as a set of operations involving materials and techniques, both new and old, and they develop these operations into architectural terms. And I think that last phrase of Hal Forster's quote is important, that the research work is developed in the framework of architecture, and it's part of architectural practice. The situation in the office then allows the practice to become a truly experimental realm. It's a place where exploring ideas and generating new knowledge takes precedence, but does not completely displace the service role of the architectural practice. It complements it. And in fact, I think that the one-time binary of the sort of experimental research architect and the service architect is really eliminated in Barkow Leibinger's work, and you'll see that, I'm sure, in the lecture. The widely published work of Barkow Leibinger has been shown at the Venice Biennale both in 2008 and 2014, the Marrakesh Biennale in 2012, and the work is in the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art in New York and the Deutsche Architectural Museum in Frankfurt. The firm has won numerous awards, including 3 national AIA honor awards for architecture and the prestigious Marcus Prize for Architecture in Milwaukee, which recognizes emerging talent in the field for design excellence and innovation is clearly the operative term in this case. And Frank is actually from our region. He's a Berlin-based architect, but from Kansas originally and grew up in Montana. So I think there's some familiarity in his understanding of our world here, and I think it is a great opportunity to have him visit us and share some of the work. So Frank, thank you very much for joining us. And
Thanks, Jeff, for that introduction. That's right. That's really that's a good introduction in terms of how we've been working and how we've been thinking for the last few years. And I think this idea of sort of a research practice, I think, has been kind of a driving force in how we've worked. We did this monograph of the work that we've been working on for the last 3 years called Spielraum, that Hal edited, Hal Forster, that is about this idea of not simply showing the work in a chronological way, how we did one thing after the other, but how we are looking for tools and looking for ways of letting the practice and how we think evolve. And I think a lot of this has to do with materials. A lot of this has to do with new technologies, emerging technologies, but we're always looking for a way to trigger new ideas in the practice in a way that's what keeps it exciting for us and to keep moving. So I was in the studios today in Jason's group and saw some of the work you were doing in the studios. So I like to see what the culture of the school is like before I show our work. But I think there was a lot of sympathy between what we're doing and what I saw today. So I had a lot of curiosity both in looking for these tools or looking at how this gets worked out, say, in an academic context or in a practice context. This little soundbite from Hal, this idea of bricolage is a way of condensing that idea from how you use bricolage, this idea of a kind of open-mindedness or this search for, again, new materials or new methods for producing architecture, both, I think, in a formal way, a kind of aesthetic way, but also in a performative way. This will be something we'll be talking about in the next couple of days in Chicago in connection to the Biennale there. But again, I think for us is to say that the practice really is about a kind of process-oriented, so that somehow we embed in the practice this idea of experimentation, trying things, trial and error, failing. And then finding ways for that to find its way into the practice projects, the building projects, installation projects, exhibitions, different things that we do. So in a way, these are chapters in the monograph in Spielraum, again, not to show simply projects, how we do them chronologically, but as sort of work areas where we focus. So the fabrication research is one we've been doing pretty intensively for at least the last 10, 15 years. This sort of soundbite, this idea of revolutions of choice, is that particularly in a place like Germany or in the Midwest, this whole region, now maybe even the so-called Rust Belt, that there was always a kind of history of fabrication, of making things, of producing things. So in a way, we're able to really tap into that and work with manufacturers, work with fabricators for producing our own components. So it's really not about using catalogs and selecting things, but the ability to actually produce much of the kind of components of our architecture, be that facades or built-in systems, that again in different materialities that we can produce ourselves directly by working closely with fabricators in their workshops. So. A lot of our, and we did a lot of factories. We built lots and lots of factories early in the practice, and as we were working for these industrial clients, particularly in southern Germany and Switzerland, we started learning about their capabilities. So one client, Trumpf, produces laser technologies. So this is an example of a machine called a Tubematic, which uses laser for cutting tube stock out of metal. So in a kind of idea of working, when we were students at Harvard, you'd typically start using software to produce shapes, and then somewhere down the road you would find materials to make a kind of architecture out of it, and tools. We started doing projects where we would start with a material or groups of material synthetically, find tools, often driven by software, that would produce forms in a certain way. So this kind of matrix of finding tools and materials and seeing how those things could be transformed. So this kind of action verb of if you do something to something in a certain way, it would produce a certain kind of formal effect. So in working with materials, we would collect partners from technology, sometimes from the architectural building industry, sometimes not. Sometimes we would do projects with car companies like BMW, so to collect these as kind of partners for producing different kinds of work in the practice. At the same time, we started to produce our own kinds of archives or manuals or catalogs, and you can do this too. Quickly, we produce these kinds of atlases in a couple of weeks. Again, not so much to show any particular project, but really to show different kinds of processes of construction through tooling, through new materials, and what kinds of, again, an atlas for us is a kind of collection, almost like a natural science history museum or something, where we would exhibit some of these processes at different scales, sometimes the scale of 1-to-1, as kinds of collections, again, almost like a kind of building catalog, but one that we produce ourselves and in a way for ourselves. So these are archives that we can go back to, you can select from them, you can keep adding to them. Some things become obsolete, some things become new with other things. And then also working with students. We really like that the practice is kind of like a studio. So we'll bring students or interns into the practice who also bring in know-how that we don't have, software know-how, or send them off to factories such as this one at Trump, where the students went down and tested that particular machine I just showed in a very kind of experimental, open-ended way, simply to see what the capacities are, how fast can they cut, how intricate can they cut, how much would it cost. And then at a kind of later point, this was an exhibition in Basel at the Swiss Architecture Museum, produced these as kind of arrays. Then there was an idea that maybe they could rotate, they could be kinetic, and then this idea evolved into a facade idea for the so-called Sweden facade project, which again has a kind of aesthetic performance in a way visually. It can be transparent, it can be opaque. At the same time, it has a kind of functional performative idea about it being sort of sun control for these spaces. So again, from the experimental component to a kind of kinetic idea about moving to a full application in a facade system in a prototypical building that we could produce. So that is a kind of very compact process of how that might happen or how that might play out. Other projects, and we also like this idea of working between different scales. In this case, we use the same technology, but with a different manufacturer in Munich to produce a series of arrays of these kind of like chandeliers, where students came in with scripting software. One cut could produce two components, which are in a way topographically adjacent to each other to produce these kinds of array as a kind of installation scaled architecture that eventually became a piece that was built for the Deutsche Bank in Berlin. Some of the thinking is also, and this is something I've talked to Sarah Whiting about a lot, but this idea of also rethinking a historical project. So in this case, the historical project, which is the space frame, which has been around for 30, 40 years, looked at that through digital technologies, how we could rethink the space frame. In this case, applied it for a facade for a museum in Zurich, the Kunsthaus there, as a kind of double facade between a kind of interstitial space for the public entrance, and then you can see the kind of climatized boxes on the right, which are the museum spaces themselves in there. Another, again, historical project that we wanted to revisit were Konrad Wachsmann's space frames. Konrad Wachsmann worked in the States. He also worked in Berlin and Germany. In wood, he did a lot of wood frame houses, balloon frame. I used to be a carpenter when I started. And then the space frame, but as a kind of steel long span structure, in this case as an aircraft hangar. So one of the projects we did recently was a showroom for Spiel in southern Germany. Spiel make these they're super awesome chainsaws. And so we thought to, in a way, dumb that project down, instead of doing a very complex steel space frame with very complex kind of, Buckminster Fuller type joints, to do a kind of chainsaw, I guess Massacre's chainsaw style version of this structure, where on the left you take they have their own forest, so they in a sense can harvest their forest, take the logs, cut them with their chainsaws, create these trusses, and then form this kind of an interior out of a very, in a way, very low-tech timber construction with a very simple pin joint to construct these huge showrooms for their clients to come and to look at their machines. So for us, in a way, it was an idea of revisiting this historical project, but also using the tools, the products that this actual company makes to produce their own building in a very economical, a very simple, quick way, and almost the idea of the material as found. So again, they have their own sort of forest adjacent to their factory here that we could simply, again, harvest to produce the elements for the building. The thicket project is similar to that in the sense that it creates a tessellated space frame project. This is very much a work in progress. It's a wire structure. It's a 2mm wire that's digitally bent by a company who makes coat hangers. And then they're bundled together with a very simple plastic zip tie. But they're incredibly strong, so they can hold these timber. There's a timber ceiling and a timber floor just in a very simple marine plywood that's incredibly strong. We built this thing, and you could hang on the roof and it wouldn't collapse or anything. And at the same time, very filigrane. That means there's no wind load because it's so thin that the air just blows through it. So we taught ourselves how to make these. We made these frames, and then we could produce 3 or 4 of these bundles in a day. This is one of the guys just zip tying these things together. You can see these little plastic joints, super simple to produce these things, which could then be arrayed. So the first step was to prototype this one-to-one. This is the connection. Again, it also has this kind of space frame logic, but these are pinned to the plywood plates, top and bottom, to produce almost a kind of domino type structure of holding these together that could produce a kind of labyrinth space. So in a way, the structure, as it gets kind of pulled apart, could do many things. It could be the lighting, you could have mechanical systems in there, you could integrate the facade with it to produce a structure that's also, in a sense, spatially and then visually completely either transparent or completely translucent through this space. So as an idea for a kind of prototype, we built one component, which is that scale. But the idea is that these things could expand into bigger and bigger arrays. In this case, this larger one, or these are kind of down views with the roof on it. So these would be little people kind of marching around through that. So like I said, it's a work in progress. So if you would like to build this on your campus, I would be happy to show up and find a place for it. So we've been out marketing this project. But again, this is in a way, a kind of client-less project that we initiated on our own in the practice to try to find a site for it. So again, we worked out the economics of it, the speed of producing this thing to produce a kind of pavilion like it. Like I said, we worked with other guys from industry. The Genus Studio is a studio ran at Harvard a few years ago. Gina was an idea for a kinetic surface. This is a kind of elastic fabric on the skin of the car, which can change, if you can open up the hood or the doors, this kind of folding idea, which I thought was an okay idea for a car, but we were very much in the idea of thinking about this as a kind of architectural solution. So at Harvard, we ran this as a housing studio for kinetic spatial constructions. More recently, we did this as a kind of demonstration. This was at the Venice Biennale last year in Rem's show on the elements of architecture. This particular room was designated for walls. You had walls, ceilings. If you went to Venice, you would have seen this. But this was a whole history of walls, from very archaic stone walls to period walls in wood to glass partition walls. And in this case, the idea was a kind of kinetic wall that would move. And we were not so much interested in as a kind of strange surface, but again, how it could change sectionally that space, that sort of slip space in between it. So we made this sort of ridiculous film, flew to Rotterdam, showed it to Rem. He said, I got to have one of these things. So that was sort of the deal. So we got the green light to go ahead and produce this thing. This is the piece produced in Venice. So it's a very narrow space in between it. The wall on the right is a kind of generic glass partition wall. The wall moved like in the model. This is Sajima sort of petting it. But the whole thing kind of moved in and out, so that the back of it was a very kind of matter-of-fact structure, kind of timber frame, which held these activators which could move in and out. So it was a kind of tongue-in-cheek a little bit, but the idea was to produce this in a double layer of Lycra. The skin is translucent. Again, really not to simply produce it as a wall, but somehow to impact that slip space, that space in between the historical walls and this as a kind of maybe more forward-looking wall. So again, looking for a kind of application for that. So around this time, we're really using these kinds of invitations, these biennales to these kinds of prototypes or these installations. So again, for us, it's not an installation in the sense like you would think of as art installation. For us, we're always in some kind of mode of prototyping these things that they could somehow rescale or find themselves in a different kind of context and program. So with the Loom Hyperbolic, we got this terrific site next to the Katobia Mosque, and Morocco has no public Museum of Modern Art. So one of the ideas of the curators was to make this stuff, put it in the public domain as a kind of place of encounter. So we went back to Berlin after we got the site, and we started producing these structures, which are quite simple. They're ruled geometry, which is ruled geometry is straight lines. So offset straight lines will produce hyperbolic surfaces with a very simple kind of in what will be timber scaffolding to produce this. So we drew these things digitally. We produced the model in a sense digitally in terms of making these templates to produce it, but then built it on site very much hands-on. So we used donkeys to bring all the materials on site. We worked with the local crafts people there to produce this thing, access very simple timber. In the souks found fabricators who would weld these steel connections to put the whole thing together. So it was a combination of, I guess, the kind of digital technology we had in the studio, and then Mohammed was one of the foremen who produced the project. So and he was an expert on sort of tying knots in this kind of woven structure. So it was a combination of the kind of local craft with, again, a kind of digital ambition for the project that actually made the project possible. So it had a scale. It was on a 5 meter by 5 meter grid. You could move around the project. You could move within it as a kind of hyperbolic structure. It worked as a kind of sunscreen. But again, the idea was to set this project up for a kind of future project in the practice. So, and again, projects like this, industrial projects, we do have to do with repetition, redundancy, and structure. So, so in a way, it was a very suggestive project for us. So, in a way, where that project landed then is a more recent project for this fellow's pavilion. There's an American Academy in Berlin. It's a kind of think tank where scholars come and work. It's on the Wannsee, so that the actual villa is back here. It's really packed. I mean, they don't have really space to study. There's lectures, and they use it as a kind of outreach place for Berlin, for Germany. So there was a site over here where we could create a kind of pavilion for the scholars, for the visitors to work as a study place. So, and it sits here in this beautiful garden which goes down to the lake, to the Wannsee, as a kind of freestanding pavilion in the garden. So the idea was to take the hyperbolic roof as a very specific, very sectionally developed idea for the project, in what otherwise is a very straightforward kind of series of study carrels, like 7 square meters and a kind of common space here, a kind of bathroom space here, and a kitchen here on a steel and timber platform. So this is up against a historical wall here. There's a kind of garden here. There's an open, larger garden on the other side, and then produced the whole structure out of a kind of prefabricated steel, and then combined it with oak floors and walls here. The heating is in the floor and in the ceiling, and then that structure, then the Marrakesh structure in a way was translated into this steel, very extremely light structure that sits on these 4 corner columns, which is also the drainage, and then had a carrel which can close behind these curtains or open up with these sliding doors, so they could use the outside, again, like I would think as a kind of Midwestern porch on the outside. So in a way, even though this is in Berlin, somehow for me is a very American type of project as a kind of freestanding, independent pavilion out there. So in the night, it's uplight, so you can read this kind of hyperbolic surface very clearly, and then we were sort of welded on a very simple membrane roof over the whole structure. So you could have these, again, you could have these kind of study spaces and then just open the doors and have this really nice connection to the garden. And some of our old teachers, this is Beatrice Colomina, one of the first fellows, advertising our building here, reading some books here, sitting on the porch. So that was sort of a great launch for us for the project. Facade, this whole thing about, it talked about, I think, in the next few days in Chicago, but this idea of facade somehow, and it's, maybe this is also a German thing, but a lot of attention in relationship to, say, sustainability. The facade is really the membrane where we're doing, where you have, in a way, the most freedom architecturally for a project. And at the same time, it's the sort of element in architecture which you have the best chance to, say, control the environment, light, wind, air, heating, cooling. So in a way, it's become a kind of site in the larger site of a kind of architectural building that we've worked on. So if you went back a few years to a competition like this Gewandhaus, which is kind of a mixed-use building in Dresden. Dresden is, if you remember from your history books, you know, this hypersensitive historical city which was destroyed terribly in World War II. This is a site for a historical building that in fact was never built there. So the idea was to look at all the buildings that were proposed for the site historically and then morph them into one form. So we wanted the building to have this kind of historical connection to the sandstone buildings around it, which most of them are Baroque. So it had the formal sort of relationship to it and the same material to do it in stone as a sandstone stacked thing, but to have a certain level of abstraction. So we looked at those kinds of surfaces and started constructing these as stone plates that you could stack almost like a kind of like a lattice type structure. So in a way, the building would be very familiar as this historical thing, but the closer you looked at it, it would be something else. It could be either completely opaque or very transparent, almost as if you sort of cut the building apart into a million pieces horizontally. So, but this is one of the projects where we really started thinking about the facade is really the architectural project of it, the whole thing, again, in terms of kind of performance, but also in this case, really the image of the building being something historically sympathetic, but at the same time being something completely new or fresh. So after, we worked for many years, again, doing, industry, doing factories out in the middle of nowhere, out in the periphery. More recently, we've been doing a lot of work in Berlin, and one of the first kind of urban projects we did was this tower, Tour Total, which is the first sort of building block in a larger master plan here, which is called Euro City. So this is the main train station over here. This is the whole, government center over here. Hitler's famous dome, this gigantic dome would have been built here on the north-south axis. So, and this is the Hamburger Bahnhof, which is an art museum over. This is sort of art center here. So we had the chance to do 2 buildings here to kind of reintroduce that. So there was a lot of attention on this building publicly, what this thing would be, how it would fit into this assemble. After all these kinds of building cycles in Berlin, the Friedrichstraße, the Potsdamer Platz, all these kinds of things that when we first arrived in Berlin were being debated and competed for. So we wanted to do a building which is for Total, French energy company, that was somehow maybe historically familiar as a frame facade. Around here you call it like a Chicago frame, which is a load-bearing facade. That's the structure. That's not simply a glass skin like you would see in the new World Trade Center tower, but would also be a kind of sustainable facade. It creates surfaces that you can insulate better. We have exterior sunscreening, and then formally it's sort of disturbed. It has a kind of almost origami quality as a surface that changes around it, and then also pedestrian. We could create a pedestrian passage between this building, which we just finished, with a metal curtain wall, and then the load-bearing wall on the right. So in a sense, it's a kind of exoskeleton where that's the structure of the building. It has a core, virtually column-free interior, flexible kind of generic office space, and then come up with a facade that's made out of precast concrete, which are shaped either as T's, which interlock like this, and then have a kind of K shape. So as I was walking around the campus here today, and it's like I saw lots and lots of buildings from the 60s and 70s that are made out of precast concrete. So you could do this too. So the technology is here also, but this is built outside of Frankfurt. We use our digital know-how to make pretty complicated forms out of plywood, so that even with the precast, and again, if you look at the precast around here, there are always like 2 or 3 components that get repeated. With the kind of digital abilities now, we've created like 160 pieces that are completely different. Some pieces are repetitive, but you could make pieces that are unique and without completely destroying the budget of the building. So and they're incredibly precise, with a kind of acid etch. They're structural. So this is we hadn't had a lot of experience with this kind of material, but we were really excited about using this material for something like as a facade. Again, it has a kind of depth, so it conditions how the light comes through the building. There's exterior sunscreens here. The windows, you can open them up so you can get fresh air. So in a way, again, these were kind of like buildings were made. Like the Flatiron building had a facade like this a little bit with awnings. So it's somehow both a kind of historical way of doing, but at the same time with modern techniques, and then formally to get a really dynamic facade that somehow moves on the diagonal visually through this kind of offset T origami cast piece, which is very very precise. And then we could also control, as a core and shell building, we could control things like the ceramic tiles in the lobbies and do the stairs and things like this. But this is when we also started to shift typology, starting to work with mid-rise to high-rise buildings. A little bit earlier, we were doing this Trutech building in Korea, which was the first project we really did outside of Europe or North America. Had no idea how to build in Asia. We went there, talked to fabricators. There was advantages there in terms of costs and fabricating that it would have been unaffordable, or they wouldn't have been allowed through legislation to do in Berlin or Germany. So we produced a facade that works like a kaleidoscope. This is a whole new sort of office park, tech park, that for us had no context. It was literally a city being built from left to right. So we had a site in a kind of very loose master plan, and the idea was, instead of trying to be contextual was to be, in a way, acontextual. So when we were students, I mean, I always loved the building like Kay and Cobb's Hancock Tower, which at the time used reflective glass, in the 70s as a way of assimilating, historical buildings like the Richardson Church here. But we would like the idea that, you can never make it flat, perfectly flat. So that there was something about the disturbance of that glass that you could exploit by simply faceting it in a very, very shallow depth that produced an amazing amount of visual effect. So, we started doing these little drawings, these sketches, understanding, limits of glass size to make the facade really three-dimensional. So there are three-dimensional elements. You can tip them on upside down to make a different type. You can combine it with flat pieces, which are more economical. We created a kind of entrance as an indentation. Drew it digitally, then started making these plywood frames to understand the geometry, then went back to Korea, hooked up the Korean guys with Arup from Hong Kong, who did workshops to produce these window frames. So in mid 2005, 2006, I mean, there really was no precedent. There was no catalog precedent for such a facade. So in a way, what was exciting for us is that you could really make this up. You could really find somebody to produce this, find ways to, with CNC, to cut it, build a mock-up, test it, blast it with, like typhoon strength, rain and wind, and see if it would work, and then go into production. So this is about the time we really found out you could really start to produce your own kind of architectural solutions for again, one-off buildings that we were doing now, all over the world. So these guys would really jump in and do it, and then produce a lot of the stuff off-site, bring it on-site, and then put the pieces up in an incredibly quick amount of time to produce, again, a kind of building that produced a really kind of astonishing visual effect, from complete kaleidoscopic reflectivity to reflecting the LED advertising across the street to becoming almost completely transparent at night. So, so it was really about that kind of visual kind of performance of the facade versus, the kind of, again, more of the kind of crafted things inside, like the suspended stair, or doing the lobby wall in a wood version of the exterior facade. So this facade making was one project in the office. The other one were a number of projects. Another sort of chapter was this idea of ultra-structural, where we started working with engineers up front, Swiss and German engineers, to produce much more ambitious sort of structural engineering projects, where the engineering wasn't simply to prop up the architecture, but in a way the engineering was the architecture and vice versa. So, and a lot of these things, which we also talked to today in the studio, was about these kinds of aggregate systems where you add things together to come up with a whole. So Trump is this client we've been working for the last 12 years or so. This is this whole industrial campus where we've been adding buildings over time. We did a couple buildings at Gatehouse here in this cantina, which is a kind of restaurant for this campus. And we sat down with Werner Sobeck, Werner Sobeck is sort of the heir of Frei Otto, who's a sort of brilliant Stuttgart structural engineer in the 60s and 70s to produce a cantina for this company. So in a way, it's a factory, but it's also like a campus. So a cantina, in a way, historically, Germany would be a kind of, in the basement, kind of a terrible cafeteria where you meet once a day, but we wanted to turn it into a kind of event pavilion where it would be a cafeteria, but you could also use it for music, for lectures, for parties, and then to create it as a kind of roof, almost like a leaf structure that would cover an excavation, which is here kind of partially underground because the whole factory is connected by tunnels at 4 meters under grade. And with the guys, the student interns, we did a series of studies where each study would consider a material. So the honeycomb one was going to be timber. The spiral is steel. This slab one was made out of concrete, precast concrete. So there was always a material idea about how this would work. The idea of being a kind of perforated surface which would cover the open space, in a way the roof is the most important thing as a kind of ceiling, and to let natural daylight move through that. So in the model you see the excavation, which kind of sets up the project. We didn't want to produce this thing as an object, but more as something that you would discover. You could go through this tunnel and then pop out and then find this space. So the emphasis is really on the space that this roof, which kind of hovers over that cutout, produces. So we found a manufacturer in the Black Forest, Holzbau Alman, who started cutting the pieces. When we went into production, we made, again, a kind of mock-up of this. It was almost like a honeycomb structure made out of glue-laminated timber with very simple steel joints that you just kind of carriage bolt through. Each piece could be unique because we can do everything with digital cutting now. So we went into these gigantic production runs in their warehouses. So they were running this project next door. They were doing Shigeru Ban's Pompidou project at the same time. These guys would like redraw all of our drawings to go into this kind of production. So we could do this all pretty quick. So we would pre-cut these things, bring them on site, put them up with these little temporary helper columns here, and then combine it in the end with steel. So we combined it with steel, so we have very few columns, these kind of column groups here. So you can essentially have almost a column-free space, which is in a way kind of generic, flexible space. You can change it by sinking the building in the ground. We developed this mezzanine space, which right away they could use, which is almost at the level of the ground above, and then could sort of program the cells. So the cells could be a skylight, or it could be an acoustical panel, or it could be artificial lighting at night. So working with Transolar, our energy engineers, we could in a way make the roof smart by targeting each cell to do something slightly different than the other one. So again, the roof is very specific. It's very, sort of tectonic, and then the spaces are very flexible. You can put tables and chairs here, or you could open it up for a party. And then again, we produce this mezzanine, which is almost at grade. These are these kinds of grass berms that define the space. But by this point, I mean, we got to the point where really we designing and fabricating everything in the building. The furniture we designed and built, the tiles we designed, the terracotta tiles, we made the precast concrete pieces here. That in a sense there was nothing off the shelf except for maybe like the door handles for the project. That everything could be in a way imagined and then fabricated and then put on site to produce, again, for us, a building as a kind of unique one-off project within the whole portfolio. That again, the kind of building at the exterior is sort of de-emphasized here. It produces a kind of exterior porch on the south, integrated into this landscape where, again, sort of socially, the building becomes the kind of center of the whole campus where people can meet, everybody, the white-collar guys, the blue-collar guys, clients and managers as a kind of place, also to meet, but also to talk and discuss, exchange ideas in a place like this. At the same time, we did the Gatehouse project also with Werner, who at the time, Werner was really keen on doing like the most insane cantilever building ever. So in this case, we really used their technology, again, the laser cutting for sheet metal. So we went back and looked at historical projects like Jean Prouvé, what he was doing in the 50s with basically, bent metal, and produced a kind of gatehouses for the entrance to this campus. So We knew that they were producing things like this. This is laser cut and laser welded, so you could do anything with this kind of technology. You could make a really strong tabletop, or you could make decking for a really big ship or something. But the scaling for us was something at the scale of the roof. So, we inherited these engineered drawings from Werner, with the kind of loading diagram, compression here, tension columns back here, and then started to interpret those drawings into this kind of variated, kind of triangulated structural roof truss for the project. So, which was quite cool. So we could build these as strips. These are the columns protected with plywood. Expansion joints here. Did a prototype here where, these are variable. The bottom chords are the cutouts are variable. Integrated the roof drain and stuff, all the kind of technical stuff, and then it became this kind of performance where we lifted this huge roof up. And then, dropped these things on the column, took the crane away, the thing kind of bounced a couple feet. It's like a giant diving board that has this kind of gigantic concrete counterweight in the ground to keep this thing, it snows like 1 or 2 meters here. So the whole thing could flex without crushing the facade here, which is glass and like entirely made of glass. So we had like a gasket here so the roof could deflect without crushing it. So the facade was also kind of a project within the larger project. It's a double facade filled with these plexiglass tubes, which again, going back to a kind of hand craftsmanship, this guy is gluing these things all together, and then they fit in between the like 2 layers of glass to produce this. So there's, so that's the sunscreening. There's additional screens that come out of the floor. The posts are made of laminated acrylic. So the entire facade is either transparent or translucent. And the effect visually is a kind of almost like a lantern to mark the entrance to this facade. So again, we were really excited about being able to work out the details, but all the fabrication to again produce a one-off building for this particular client, and for the first time to really use the client's technology directly in the kind of architectural expression of the project. At the same time, we were trying to down the street for these guys. I'm glad it's not Volkswagen, but they're still rocking and rolling. But they have a museum that Ben Van Berkel did a few years ago, a historical museum, a car sales, and this is going to be a museum of the future. So this idea of ultra-structural here came out of making stuff. We were interested in plywood and bending it. Of course, we had the Albert Alto furniture. We made these digital templates that we could bend this veneer plywood through to produce these forms that would make a kind of structural roof. So in reality, this would be a 9 meter by 9 meter grid. It would be translated from wood to steel. The steel and the coils would be hollow, and you would fill them with water. So the water would be the heating and the cooling for the whole building in a 9 meter by 9 meter steel grid. So for us, that was like everything. You could have something that would condition the light into the space. It would be the mechanical systems. It would be the structural systems. It would be an idea for car guys, about movement and a kind of dynamic that was familiar to them. So some of the things we did while we were doing the architectural competition was, we treated it again as a kind of installation scale, tested in a scale of a small architectural gallery around the corner from the office. And then looked at the scale of the museum, which is a 140 meter, which is, pretty big, like 100 meters is like a football field. So in this kind of loop structure, and then on the sides would be the shops, the kind of workshops for the cars they could work on, and then parking on the other side, that you would have, again, this kind of coil loop, which is the structure. At the same time, you could have partition walls that would divide different areas of the museum to produce this kind of place for experimentation for Daimler and Mercedes-Benz. So this could be a theater space. Within that, that's the coil roof here. Or it could be a kind of exhibition space for God knows what Mercedes-Benz thinks about, again, the future of mobility. So in this kind of mezzanine space and a space through here. So there's, again, this idea of ultra-structural sponsored or in a way categorically kind of grabbed a number of projects, including this one, which I'll show in Chicago in the next couple days for the Smart Materials House for Hamburg. IBA is the International Building Exhibition that's been happening in Germany for like 80 years. International building exhibitions were a way of looking at experimental housing for affordable housing or low-income housing that can be done quickly and cheaply. So we won a competition for a smart materials house. So it should be about smart materials that are thinking about sustainability and these things. And so we started to ask ourselves what would be smart. So this is residential. This produces like 12 apartments in this prefab. It was something that could change. We also looked at a version of this where it was a one-story pavilion. But the idea was really to force ourselves to start with the materials. So we started with infralight concrete, which is it's a concrete that's self-insulated. The aggregate is not stone, but it's either recycled glass or clay. So it's super light. If you put this in a bathtub, it'll float. And then to combine it with wood, like timber decking. So for us, it was like thinking backwards, like sort of unorthodox to combine timber with precast. But so these became our materials. So what was interesting about using infralight concrete is like the thicker you make it, the better it is. So in terms of insulation, so and modernism was always about thinness, right? Like steel and glass to make it as thin as possible. So we look at historical things like this idea of a kind of material poché or thickness, and then came up with this component. So the idea of the component was that it would be multitasking. It has a certain formal shape, which means it's self-supporting. You can drop this thing on a floor and it won't fall over. You don't need scaffolding. We had these coils in it, so it could be the heating, it could be the coiling, it could be solar absorption, and we were working with these the sustainable architecture engineers, and we always hated the idea that the sustainable stuff is the stuff you simply tack onto your architecture. And again, we wanted the idea to be that it was totally integrated, that sustainable idea was the architectural idea at the same time. So we made these components, which again are for housing. So they would have a kind of residential, domestic scale to them. We could combine these things. They just start and stop, so you could combine them with simple wood, like timber windows, and do a limited amount of parts. So because the wood floors are self-insulated and the concrete elements are self-insulated, you don't have any kind of cold bridge problem. So each floor plate could be unique, slightly different, these kind of floor plates. And we made a 9-square grid, so you could have a kind of open loft-like work-live space, or if you like little rooms, you could have partition walls and make rooms. And so, but also structurally it was interesting because the whole thing works like a house of cards. You can simply stack these pieces over each other. They don't have to line up. They can overlap to produce that kind of project. And again, because of this kind of material thickness, we photographed the models and it produced a very different quality of light. There was a kind of softness about the light moving into these spaces which was quite different than the kinds of projects we did with, say, steel or glass that had a kind of thinness. So you had this very kind of articulate, undulating outside versus, the very straightforward gridded or partition spaces in between. So to understand how this system worked, we built these, huge, large 1:20 scale models to see how it worked. So they were super stable. You could, and it had this kind of reversibility about it too. So the interiors would make one kind of space at the same time residually you would get a balcony space. So each unit could have these little balconies around the corners of the building. So to figure out how to do this, how to build these things, we won a prize from Holcim, which are these Swiss concrete makers. So they're very keen on seeing this thing fly. So we took the money and got the actual materials that we would use, prototype a wall, tested it, loaded it, tried different surface finishes on it, saw how it worked, and then kept going with the project. So the latest version of this project is so-called urban living. This is in Berlin for high-rise structures for low-income housing. In the context of the Karl Marx Allee, this was the former East Berlin. This is where the sort of district of Plattenbau, these were prefabricated concrete buildings. So this is Khrushchev in the 50s. Supervising this model where you could build these sort of Eastern European housing very quickly. So the idea was, in a way, to rethink that project for a point tower. So Berlin, there's been this sort of need to produce housing, at least 6,000 units a year. How do you add density in Berlin? How do you add density within the kind of constraints or the kinds of opportunities based on setbacks, legislation, how you can do that. So in the last few months, as all of you have been reading, there's been this huge sort of influx of refugees into Germany. This year alone, 800,000. Next year could be 500,000. The year after that could be 500,000 more. So there's even more sort of urgency in terms of producing right now temporary housing, but how to produce more permanent housing in a quick and economical way. So in a way, this project keeps getting more and more urgent in a way. So we did a survey where we located sites within this whole sort of region where we can drop in that kind of a building, that kind of high-rise of the prototype, again, without negatively impacting existing housing around it. So in a way, strategies for density. And this is the studio also we ran in the spring with our Harvard students on housing. So again, this is a kind of project, work in progress, but only recently it's become even exceedingly more important to somehow find solutions in a city, of 3 million, like Berlin, that could accommodate both the kind of local population as well as this huge influx of refugees coming into Germany. Again, it would be similar to the Hamburg project in terms of producing very simple, column-free, loft-like spaces that have exterior space, that have interior space that can be either left open or can be partitioned into smaller rooms. The other category, this idea of makeover is one where we're not always doing new construction, but I think also in a place like Europe, you're often dealing with existing housing stock or dealing with existing buildings that need to be transformed, either because of programmatic transformation or material or performance transformation. So in one case was the Charité Hospital, this was the major hospital in East Berlin before the wall came down. That is also a kind of precast concrete facade that's literally falling apart, that leaks, that's terrible in terms of energy use. So the idea here was to produce a facade that had a certain formal effect in a way to dematerialize this, really out of scale, heavy building within this sort of beautiful historical context that would somehow do all of that. So the solution was this skin, which is a double facade with an outside so-called Prallscheibe, which is just a single layer of glass, which protects the hospital rooms acoustically. But at the same time, by simply moving those surfaces slightly, produces this kind of formal effect of the surfaces. You get a very dynamic kind of undulating surfaces. At the same time, we find ourselves repurposing our own projects. This is a so-called biosphere project, which we did back in 2002. This was a militarized site used by the Soviets. It was transformed into a public park. We produced a building that was like the project, like the park, created by a series of berms with a very simple flat roof, like a giant infrastructure project. We cut into the ground to produce a kind of greenhouse on the inside. So it ran as a kind of garden pavilion for the garden show, and then it ran as a kind of like an attraction for 10, 15 years. In the third sort of iteration of this project, we're looking at putting a school, like a school within it. So these would be classrooms that we could insert into the space, which looks like this right now. The building right now is earmarked for temporary housing. For the refugees that are coming in, but somehow this has become part of the reality of the practice of actually been doing this long enough that you go back and revisit your older projects and find ways to repurpose them. So the programmatic life of this project was maybe 12 years, and then it will go into another very temporary programmatic use now, and then go into a kind of longer one. So in a way, this is kind of, I think, sort of the dirty realism of the practice or some of the projects that we've been doing. So, and having the chance to go back and kind of revisit these kinds of projects and rethink them. In the last category, site-specific, is maybe going back to, for us, maybe more of a European kind of project, which is making projects, again, that are tailored or unique to a particular site, that in a way the conditions of the site are what produced the project. So that would in a way be the opposite of, say, the Korean project, which is really about dropping in to a site that hasn't really been formulated or is emerging. So with the Estrella Tower, which is a competition we won last year, which will be the highest tower in Berlin. It's a kind of threshold site between Neukölln, the kind of periphery out here, and off to the left will be the new airport, and on the right is Neukölln, which is the 19th century city. So in a way, the building will become a gateway between the existing Hotel Estrella here, which is kind of from the 80s, and create a new kind of ensemble of buildings from hotel, offices, parking, and a kind of Congress center on the right. So in the figure ground plan, the building is here, which is kind of hard to see, but it's a gateway in the sense that this is the kind of historical city leading to the center. This is a more kind of fragmented peripheral part of the city, which leads out to the new airport. So in a way, the building was transitional. So at this time, we were doing Alexanderplatz that Frank Gehry ended up winning. With all the kind of problems of working in an inner city site, we had a certain amount of freedom to work out here in terms of just adjacencies to existing buildings. So in a way, the building does work like a kind of gateway here. We thought about the project as Tangram, which is a children's game of just triangulated pieces that you can assemble as a kind of puzzle and extrude to different heights to produce the project, which is this. So this is the building connecting across to the neighborhood, which does produce this gate as a series of triangles, which then encloses this atrium space, which is kind of the core, the entrance of the space, and then you can add at a later date this flat sort of Congress hall. So really the idea of the project, which was, I mean, Berlin was funny because it has no real tradition of high-rise buildings like, say, Chicago or New York. High-rises tend to be solitary buildings. There is no sort of core like Manhattan, where you have high-rises populating a whole area. It works as a kind of one-off. At the same time, we didn't simply want to drop a high-rise, 180 meters in the middle of this neighborhood, but really works as a kind of ensemble of different scaled buildings to to help mediate that thing, this tower to this kinds of context, and to have a very simple kind of circulation connection through the project. So it does become a kind of assemblage of different elements that do that. So this is the project which we're just starting right now with the high-rise, a kind of roof terrace that faces the city, and then the other buildings which are articulated that help break the scale down of the building, which again center around a large central atrium which kind of organizes the whole structure. Again, we've just started, but we'll also have different ideas of facade making for a kind of facade, kind of family of different facades that will make each one of these elements unique, but that add up to this greater whole of components and to the ground, where this opens out to the water, to the canal back over here. I think that was the last slide, but again, the idea tonight was really to show what kinds of work areas, and I think I still like this question, this what's next question, so I think we're always on the lookout for that. But again, I hope what would the setup of these different projects would show how, again, we anticipate or we think about what could be next in how we work. And again, that gives us, I think, as a practice, an enormous amount of freedom, and I think it's also what makes the practice really exciting for us, both for us have been running the practice as well as people working there and students who come and work with us also. So thanks again for the invitation. It's super nice to be here. Yeah. If you want to leave, you can leave, but if anybody has questions, I'm happy to field them. Well, the purpose of the curators was to, it was a biennale for art and architecture. And the idea of the biennale was to have that in the public domain, so it wouldn't be in a museum somewhere like here. So they gave us sites all over town. Some of the sites were interior, some of them are exterior. So we had an exterior one. So the idea next to that mosque is a ruin. You could kind of see the remains of an earlier mosque that had been built there. So the idea was to make it a kind of place of encounter. So it was a place that nobody would really go to, sort of open that up as a public space. So Marrakesh is a place. It's filled with millions of tourists, but it's also the locals there. So I think the idea for them was to somehow, it was temporary, it was there for like 4 months, was to produce that construction so people would go there and use it. So, and to make this idea, I guess, of in a way sort of modern art somehow be accessible and given both to the community as well as the people who are visiting there. So, but then in constructing it, what was interesting was that we worked with the local craftsmen. So if you ever go to Marrakesh, it's like filled with these souks, which are these kinds of covered passages where there's millions of these little shops. So you have somebody who does welding, you have somebody who does weaving, somebody who does ceramics. So we could literally employ these guys to produce the piece. So one of the ideas was how do you translate the digital world into a kind of hand craftsman world, and that was the donkeys and the yarn that we used, and then the timber to produce it, and then the other idea was to produce it as a kind of prototype. It was a kind of structural prototype that we scaled for that, but. The idea was to show how the other iteration was it became that pavilion at the American Academy. It was like a different version of that project. But so in a way, we use those kinds of biennale exhibition kinds of projects usually to set something else up. But we also, it's like the Korean projects, like when you get on the ground, like what could you do? What are the opportunities that we had there that we wouldn't have, say, in Berlin or in Connecticut or someplace else we've worked at, or Chicago, we're doing a project there. So we like this idea of kind of exploiting those conditions. So we could do that project very quickly, very economically, based on that world. So that was really the interest of that project. and what that project meant to that city for 6 months, or however long it was up. Oh, like failure? Yeah. We have lots of failures, yeah. It's always like fail better, fail again. Yeah, that's usually, yeah, we've had things that are like catastrophic, where they just, like the client kicks it out, forget it. I mean, but somehow if you don't have that built in, the ability of risk, like to try things, then it's hard to get forward. And usually buildings cost a lot of money and things need to work, but somehow we try to, and I guess that's the sort of research aspect in the office, that you could do things that fail. I mean, the kinetic wall it would cost so much to produce that. To make that thing real would need, it works, but the expenditure and the complexity of it, to dumb that thing down to make it real would need like 4 or 5 more steps, So a lot of these projects are sort of questions to ourselves or provocations that still aren't real. But I like the idea of failure. The wall we made was terrible. That wall I showed, it was terrible. If you look at that thing in detail, I mean, it looks like somebody, made it by hand or something. And we've done, 3 or 4, newer versions of that are much better. So, but like we talk to guys in car industries and stuff, like how to get an electric car right. I mean, it takes all these steps. So I think that's an important aspect of. You start with material, like it's somehow it's difficult to predict what the outcome's going to be because we haven't done it before. We haven't done it that way before. So that idea of crashing and burning, I think, is important. Yeah, I mean, the first part I think it's like I don't know. I think the attitude is like if you need a hammer, then you use a hammer. If you need a chainsaw, then you use the chainsaw. There was never any kind of mantra like. I've had arguments with people like Patrick Schumacher, from Zaadi, that everything will be parametric and that will save the world. But it's more of a catch can, It's always been, I think it's always been hybrid in terms of using different techniques as they're available. Again, it might be between different building cultures, say, and I think. And that really talks to me, about the idea of bricolage, about combining different aspects, and it wasn't, digital, analog, it's all the same to me. It could be ceramic, something you make by hand. It may be something that is built by a 2 million euro machine. It doesn't matter. So we access things kind of across the board that way. And that's sort of the, like we were looking at timber in Germany. It's still cheaper to build a single-family house in masonry. So you do that, So you're kind of working within the systems, the logics of these systems, and the economics of systems, and then it's kind of pushing and pulling where you go through. And then the second part of your question, I think there is a kind of willingness. That. In terms of manufacturers and fabricators, that like we did one project with manufacturers, they make coat hangers. Well, could you do a coat hanger that was 2.50 meters and looks like this? And we're like, well, yeah, I guess so. How much would it cost? 60 cents. Okay, then why don't you do 5,000 for us? Okay, so that they either don't. But there's also a certain curiosity. If you looked at Trump, the company he works with, you go in their museum, they do parts for Alessi, they do fenders for Harley Davidson, they do airplane wings, they do gas tanks for Audi. So there's a kind of curiosity in looking for applications anyway, because of this whole culture of making stuff. So it's somehow that sort of introduction always seems quite easy. It's always easy to knock on doors and find somebody that's willing to do it, and they will also help you get things in. When we worked with the wood fabricators in the Black Forest, Sobek was going in with titanium joints, that would have been completely unaffordable, and they would say, well, why don't you do this So there's a kind of back and forth where, in terms of pulling something off that that helps make things simpler or easier to do. So that kind of, so we find a lot of those dialogues that happen up front in a process. So we end up working with fabricators or engineers usually at the beginning of the process rather than, you know, in the middle somewhere. Like, here's our architectural idea, let's do this and this. So a lot of those, again, I have to talk about this tomorrow, but I think this is more of an idea of a synthetic approach where you are kind of combining techniques, but also levels of know-how or ability. Germans would say Fähigkeit, a kind of how you do things. I think so. Sure.